The Indian Ocean stretches endless and empty, 200 kilometers off the coast of Western Australia. Here, beneath 2.5 kilometers of black water, two warships lie in their final resting place, victims of an encounter so swift and devastating that for 67 years the world could not be certain where they fell. On the 19th of November, 1941, the Pride of the Royal Australian Navy met a German raider disguised as an innocent merchant vessel. Within 30 minutes, both ships were mortally wounded. By dawn, both had slipped beneath the waves. But from the German raider Cormoran, 318 men would survive. From HMS Sydney, not one. 645 Australian sailors vanished without a trace. No bodies recovered, no lifeboats found with survivors, no final radio message, nothing but silence and an empty sea. This is the story of how Australia's greatest naval hero became Australia's greatest naval tragedy, of how a few minutes of miscalculation transformed victory into catastrophe, and of the mystery that would haunt a nation for nearly 7 decades. To understand what happened off the Western Australian coast, we must first understand what HMAS Sydney had become, and what her crew believed themselves to be. She was a modified Leander-class light cruiser, built on the Tyne in England, and commissioned into the Royal Australian Navy in September 1935. At 562 feet in length and displacing nearly 9,000 tons fully loaded, Sydney was among the most modern warships in the Southern Hemisphere. Her main armament consisted of 8 6-inch guns and 4 twin turrets, weapons capable of hurling 100-pound shells nearly 23 kilometers. She could make 32 knots, faster than most vessels she would ever encounter. But specifications alone do not make legends. Sydney earned her reputation in blood. When Italy entered the Second World War in June 1940, Sydney was serving with the Royal Navy's 7th Cruiser Squadron in the Mediterranean. Within weeks, she would fire her guns in anger for the first time, bombarding the Italian-held Libyan port of Bardia. But it was an encounter less than a month later that would transform her into a national icon. On the 19th of July, 1940, Sydney was covering 4 British destroyers conducting anti-submarine sweeps north of Crete when lookouts spotted Italian warships on the horizon. 2 enemy cruisers, Bartolomeo Colleoni and Giovanni delle Bandinere, had stumbled upon the British force. What followed would become one of the most celebrated single-ship actions of the war. Captain John Collins ordered Sydney to close with the enemy at maximum speed. At 8:30 that morning, Sydney opened fire at a range of 17,000 meters, and almost immediately began scoring hits. The Italian cruisers, outmatched in both gunnery and seamanship, attempted to flee. Sydney pursued. Within the hour, a shell from Sydney struck Bartolomeo Colleoni's engine room, severing steam lines and leaving the Italian cruiser dead in the water. British destroyers moved in and finished her with torpedoes. The Bartolomeo Colleoni rolled over and sank, taking 121 of her crew with her. Sydney herself escaped almost unscathed. A single Italian shell had punched through her forward funnel without exploding. One sailor received a minor shrapnel wound. That was all. The victory electrified Australia. Here was proof that the Royal Australian Navy could match any navy in the world. When Sydney returned to her namesake city in February 1941, thousands lined the harbor to welcome her home. A public holiday was declared so schoolchildren could watch her crew march through the streets. Commemorative medals were struck and presented to every man aboard. Admiral Andrew Cunningham, commanding the Mediterranean Fleet, had already given Sydney her nickname, the Stormy Petrel, a vessel that brought destruction wherever she appeared. But reputations, as history repeatedly demonstrates, can be dangerous things. While Sydney was earning glory in the Mediterranean, another vessel was being prepared for a very different kind of warfare. In the shipyards of Hamburg, workers were transforming the cargo freighter Steiermark into something far more deadly. She had been built for the Hamburg-America line, a 9,000-ton merchantman with diesel-electric engines capable of 18 knots. She had never completed a single commercial voyage when war was declared. Now she would never make one. The conversion was undertaken with meticulous care. Behind false hull plates on her forecastle and quarterdeck, workers installed 6 15-centimeter naval guns, weapons salvaged from obsolete battleships, including one that had served on the battlecruiser SMS Seydlitz during the First World War. Hidden beneath deck level, Mounted on hydraulic platforms that could raise them into firing position in seconds were 5 20mm anti-aircraft guns. Concealed behind lifting flaps on the upper deck were torpedo tubes. Deep in her holds, she carried over 300 naval mines. From the outside, she looked like any other tired merchantman plying the world's shipping lanes. She was designated Hilfskreuzer 8, Auxiliary Cruiser 8, and given the name Cormoran, after the cormorant seabird that dives silently beneath the water to seize its prey. Her captain was Theodor Detmers, a 38-year-old Korvettenkapitän who had served on destroyers during the Norwegian campaign. He was the youngest man ever to command a German merchant raider, and he understood perfectly the nature of his mission. Germany could not match the Royal Navy in conventional warfare, but commerce raiders, disguised warships prowling the world's oceans, appearing as innocent merchantmen until the moment they struck, could force the British to divert warships across millions of square miles of ocean. Every cruiser hunting a raider was a cruiser not protecting convoys. Every merchantman sunk was cargo that would never reach Britain. In December 1940, Cormoran slipped out of the Baltic, disguised as the Soviet freighter Vyacheslav Molotov. She broke through the Denmark Strait in a violent storm and emerged into the Atlantic, ready to hunt. Over the following 11 months, Cormoran would sink or capture 11 Allied vessels totaling over 68,000 tons. She disguised herself variously as Japanese and Dutch merchantmen, changed her appearance by altering funnel markings and superstructure, and ranged from the South Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. By November 1941, she had rounded the Cape of Good Hope and entered Australian waters. Detmers planned to lay mines off Cape Leeuwin and the approaches to Fremantle, then proceed to Shark Bay before continuing to the East Indies. The Seawolf was prowling closer to Australia than any German warship had ventured in the war, and HMAS Sydney was sailing directly toward her. On the 11th of November, 1941, HMAS Sydney departed Fremantle escorting the troopship SS Zealandia toward Singapore. She was carrying 8,000 soldiers of the 8th Division, Australian Imperial Force, to reinforce the British garrison in Malaya. The voyage was uneventful. On the 17th of November, Sydney handed Zealandia over to HMS Durban at the Sunda Strait and turned for home. She was scheduled to arrive at Fremantle late on the 20th of November. Captain Joseph Burnett stood on the bridge as Sydney steamed south through the Indian Ocean. He was 41 years old, a career naval officer who had graduated from the Royal Australian Naval College in its very first class. He had served in the Grand Fleet during the First World War, qualified as a gunnery specialist, and spent years in staff positions developing Australia's naval defences. He had taken command of Sydney in May, 6 months earlier, replacing the celebrated John Collins. Burnett was considered a highly capable officer. His service record was impeccable, but he had spent most of the war in administrative positions. He had not commanded Sydney during her Mediterranean triumphs, and he had never faced a German commerce raider. On the afternoon of the 19th of November, Sydney was steaming northward approximately 150 nautical miles southwest of Carnarvon. The weather was fine, the sea calm. At 4 minutes to 4 in the afternoon, Lookout spotted a vessel on the horizon. She appeared to be a merchantman, heading north at moderate speed. Burnett ordered Sydney to close for identification. It was standard procedure. German raiders had been active in the Indian Ocean. Sydney's duty was to verify that every vessel in these waters was what she appeared to be. Aboard Cormoran, the masthead lookout had spotted Sydney at almost the same moment. Captain Detmers immediately recognized that the approaching vessel was a warship. He ordered Cormoran to alter course toward the sun, hoping to force the warship to approach with the glare in her eyes. He increased speed to 14 knots, the maximum Cormoran could manage with her temperamental engines, and he ordered his crew to action stations. 399 men moved silently to their positions. Gunners crouched behind the false hull plates concealing the 15-centimeter batteries. Torpedo crews stood ready at the hidden tubes. Ammunition handlers waited in the magazines. On deck, crewmen in civilian clothing moved about casually, maintaining the appearance of an ordinary merchant vessel. What followed next would determine whether both ships lived or died. Sydney closed rapidly on the suspicious vessel, her superior speed cutting the distance between them. At approximately 5 o'clock, Sydney was close enough to begin the identification challenge. Signal lamps flashed across the water. "You should make your signal letters." Aboard Cormoran, Detmers had prepared for this moment. His ship was disguised as the Dutch freighter Straat Malacca, and he had memorized her signal letters and documentation. The problem was that Allied merchantmen now carried secret call signs, codes that would confirm their identity to challenging warships. Cormoran, obviously, did not possess the Straat Malacca's secret code. Detmers ordered the Dutch flag hoisted and the signal letters PKQI run up the halyards. He needed to buy time, and to draw Sydney closer. Why closer? Because at long range, Sydney's superior firepower would be decisive. Her 8 6-inch guns could destroy Cormoran without the raider ever being able to respond effectively. But at close range, very close range, Cormoran's concealed weapons could strike before Sydney could react. The torpedo tubes, useless at distance, became lethal at 1,000 meters. The rapid-firing anti-aircraft guns, worthless against armored targets at range, could sweep Sydney's exposed decks and bridge with devastating effect. Every minute that passed without Sydney opening fire was another minute that Cormoran survived. And Sydney was not opening fire. The signals continued back and forth. Sydney demanded clarification of the signal letters. Cormoran complied. Sydney asked where the vessel was bound. Cormoran replied, "Batavia." Then, Sydney signaled the letters IK, the middle portion of the Straat Malacca's secret Allied call sign. It was a test. If the vessel was truly the Straat Malacca, she would recognize the code and respond correctly. Detmers had no idea what IK meant. The Germans fumbled with signal flags, pretending confusion, playing for time. They broadcast a false distress signal on the maritime frequency, a QQ message indicating they had spotted a suspicious ship, to maintain their pretense of innocence. By now, Sydney had closed to approximately 1,500 meters. She was almost parallel to Cormoran, steaming on the same heading, both vessels making about 14 knots. It was point-blank range. The final signal came from Sydney at 5:30. "Show your secret sign." Detmers could not comply. The moment of decision had arrived. What happened next took less than 30 seconds. Detmers gave a single command. The German naval ensign shot up the halyards. The false hull plates concealing Cormoran's forward and after batteries crashed down. Hydraulic platforms raised the anti-aircraft guns above deck level, and Cormoran opened fire with every weapon that would bear. The first shells from the 15-centimeter guns were aimed at Sydney's bridge, the nerve center of the ship, where her captain and senior officers stood. The opening salvo fell short and over, bracketing the target. But the second salvo struck home. 3 shells smashed into Sydney's bridge structure, the director tower, and the forward superstructure. The destruction was instantaneous. Men who had been standing at their posts 1 second were torn apart by explosions the next. Fire erupted. Glass, steel, and human remains flew through the air. In those first seconds, Sydney lost her ability to fight as a coordinated warship. Her captain was almost certainly killed or mortally wounded. Her gunnery directors were smashed. Her communications were severed. The third and fourth salvos from Cormoran struck Sydney's forward turrets, A and B, destroying them before they could fire more than a single salvo. The fifth salvo hit at the waterline near the forward engine room. Another shell detonated the Walrus reconnaissance aircraft on its catapult amidships, spreading burning aviation fuel across the deck. Sydney had managed to return fire, but her shells either passed over Cormoran or punched through her funnel and superstructure without exploding. The range was so close that the 6-inch shells could not arm themselves properly. Meanwhile, Cormoran's torpedo crews had launched 2 torpedoes at the moment the guns opened fire. One of them struck Sydney just forward of A turret, ripping open her bow below the waterline. Within 5 minutes, Sydney was a burning wreck. But she was not finished fighting. As Sydney's forward weapons fell silent, her after turrets, X and Y, began firing in local control. Without the central director, each turret fought independently, their crews aiming through their own sights at the enemy less than 2,000 meters away. These shells found their mark. Cormoran began taking hits in her engine room and machinery spaces. An oil tank caught fire, and the flames spread rapidly through the compartments below decks. Her engines failed, leaving her dead in the water. Sydney, still underway but barely controllable, suddenly turned hard to port. The Germans believed she was attempting to ram. Cormoran managed to launch a third torpedo as Sydney swung across her bow, but it missed. For the next 20 minutes, the two crippled vessels continued to exchange fire. Sydney, unable to turn her jammed-after turrets, launched torpedoes of her own from her starboard tubes. All of them missed. By 6 o'clock, Sydney was moving away to the south-southeast, trailing smoke and flames. Her speed had dropped to perhaps 1.5 knots, barely more than a walking pace. Her forward section was flooding through the torpedo hole. Fires burned along her entire length. Cormoran continued to fire as long as Sydney remained within range. The raiders' guns fell silent at approximately 6:30 when the range had opened to 10,000 meters. Both ships were dying. Aboard Cormoran, damage control parties fought to contain the fires, but the pumps had been destroyed and the flames were spreading toward the minehold. At 9:15, Detmers ordered the crew to abandon ship. Lifeboats were lowered, rafts were launched. 318 men, officers, sailors, and the Chinese laundrymen who had served in the ship's galley, left the burning raider. At midnight, scuttling charges detonated in the minehold. 300 mines exploded simultaneously. Cormoran broke in two and plunged to the bottom. But what of Sydney? Throughout the evening of the 19th of November, the German survivors in their lifeboats and rafts could see a glow on the southern horizon. It was Sydney, still burning, still afloat, drifting slowly through the darkness. Sometime after 10 o'clock, the glow began to fade. By midnight, it had vanished entirely. And so had HMAS Sydney. 645 men, 41 officers, 594 sailors, 6 Royal Australian Air Force personnel, and 4 civilian canteen staff disappeared into the Indian Ocean without a single survivor, without a single witness to record their final moments. What happened to them in those last hours will never be known with certainty, but the evidence suggests a nightmare beyond imagination. Modern analysis indicates that by the time the main battle ended, perhaps 70% of Sydney's crew were already dead or dying. The first German salvos had swept her decks with shrapnel from high-explosive shells, each detonation generating thousands of red-hot fragments. Men caught in the open were torn apart. Men below decks were killed by concussion, fire, or the flooding that followed the torpedo hit. Those who survived the battle faced a crippled ship. Sydney's lifeboats, mounted on the upper deck where German shells had struck repeatedly, were destroyed or rendered useless. Her Carly floats, simple cork and canvas life rafts, were either blown overboard or damaged beyond use, and Sydney herself was sinking. At some point during the night, the structural damage to her bow became catastrophic. The weight of her forward anchors and chains, combined with the flooding through the torpedo hole, placed unbearable stress on the hull. The bow section tore away and plunged vertically toward the bottom. With her bow gone, the rest of Sydney flooded rapidly. Within 2 minutes, she followed her severed bow into the abyss, carrying her surviving crew with her. There was no time to abandon ship. There was no way to abandon ship. The men of HMAS Sydney died in the darkness, 200 kilometers from land, without any chance of rescue. For nearly 2 weeks, Australia did not know that HMAS Sydney was lost. The first indication that something had gone wrong came on the 21st of November when Sydney failed to arrive at Fremantle as scheduled. Naval authorities initially assumed she had been delayed or had diverted for some operational reason. It was not until the 23rd that radio stations began broadcasting urgent messages demanding that Sydney report her position. There was no response. On the 24th, the first Cormoran survivors reached Australian territory. 26 Germans were picked up by the liner Aquitania and landed at Sydney. Their interrogation revealed what had happened. HMAS Sydney was gone. But where were her crew? The Germans had seen the cruiser burning, drifting south. Surely some men had survived. Surely lifeboats had been launched. Surely at any moment news would come of Australian sailors being rescued from the sea. It never came. Royal Australian Air Force Lockheed Hudsons searched the ocean for days. Merchant vessels diverted from their routes to scan the waters. 4 naval auxiliary vessels departed Fremantle to comb the area. They found cormorants' lifeboats still carrying German survivors. They found debris from the raider. From HMAS Sydney, they found only a single waterlogged lifebelt and an empty, damaged Carly float. On the 30th of November, Prime Minister John Curtin stood before the Australian people and announced that HMAS Sydney had been lost with all hands. 645 men were dead, more than a third of all Royal Australian Navy personnel who would die in the entire war. The news struck Australia like a physical blow. Sydney had been a symbol of national pride, proof that Australia could hold her own against any enemy. Now she was gone, and with her an entire generation of young men. Wives received telegrams informing them that their husbands were missing as a result of enemy action. Children learned that their fathers would never come home. Parents buried empty coffins. And because there were no Australian survivors to explain what had happened, the questions began immediately. Why did Sydney approach so close to an unverified vessel? Every naval officer understood the danger of commerce raiders. Sydney herself had been hunting raiders in the Indian Ocean for months. Captain Burnett had served as Deputy Chief of Naval Staff. He knew better than almost anyone the threat these disguised warships posed. Yet he brought his ship within 1,500 meters of an unknown merchantman, so close that Sydney's superior firepower and armor meant nothing. At that range, Cormoran's hidden guns were just as deadly as Sydney's 6-inch batteries. The torpedoes that might have been easily evaded at distance became unavoidable. Why? The answer died with Captain Burnett. But historians have proposed several theories. Burnett may have been following conflicting standing orders. Wartime instructions emphasized that merchantmen and supply ships should be captured if possible, not destroyed. Allied shipping losses were so severe that every vessel saved was valuable. The recommended method was to close quickly and deploy boarding parties before crews could scuttle their ships. Perhaps Burnett was preparing to capture what he believed to be a legitimate merchantman. He may have been influenced by a recent incident involving HMAS Canberra, which had engaged a suspected raider supply ship at maximum range and failed to capture her. Post-action analysis suggested that a closer approach might have succeeded. Burnett had commented on this action in his capacity as a staff officer. Or perhaps he was simply deceived. Cormoran's disguise was excellent. She looked exactly like an elderly Dutch freighter, the kind of vessel that plied these waters by the dozen. Her crew maintained the charade perfectly, moving about the deck in civilian clothing, fumbling with signal flags like inexperienced merchant sailors. Whatever the reason, the decision was fatal. But the mystery did not end there. The complete absence of survivors from Sydney tormented the Australian public for decades. 318 Germans had escaped from Cormoran. Why had not a single Australian survived from Sydney? Conspiracy theories multiplied. Some claimed that German survivors had machine-gunned Australians in the water, a war crime covered up by authorities. Others insisted that a Japanese submarine had been involved, that the government was concealing evidence to prevent panic. Some accused the Germans of firing while flying a false surrender flag, of violating every law of war. The German survivors denied these accusations consistently. Their accounts of the battle remained largely unchanged under repeated interrogation. Australian intelligence officers assessed their testimony as truthful and generally accurate, but without physical evidence, without the wrecks themselves, the mystery could not be solved. For 67 years, the ships remained lost. The search for HMAS Sydney began almost immediately after her loss, but the technology of 1941 was hopelessly inadequate for the task. The ocean off Western Australia drops rapidly from the continental shelf to depths of 3,000 meters and more. The exact position of the battle was uncertain. The search area covered thousands of square kilometers of trackless water. Successive expeditions over the following decades came up empty. The Royal Australian Navy conducted surveys whenever opportunity allowed. Civilian researchers proposed various locations. All failed. By the 1990s, finding Sydney had become something of a national obsession. In 1997, the Australian Parliament held its largest inquiry to date, receiving hundreds of submissions from researchers, family members, and amateur investigators. But no one could narrow the search area sufficiently to make a deep-water expedition practical. Then, in 2003, a group of determined Australians formed the Finding Sydney Foundation. Their goal was simple: locate the wrecks and give the families of the lost crew the closure they had been denied for more than 6 decades. The Foundation's search director was David Mearns, an American-born British marine scientist who had already located some of the world's most famous shipwrecks, including HMS Hood and the German battleship Bismarck. Mearns brought scientific rigor to a search that had previously been conducted largely through guesswork. His breakthrough came from an unlikely source, Captain Detmers himself. During his years as a prisoner of war in Australia, Detmers had hidden an encoded account of the battle in a German-English dictionary, marking the letters with barely visible dots. This document, preserved by Detmers's family, provided precise information about Cormoran's position at the time of the engagement. Combined with drift analysis of the German lifeboats and modern oceanographic modeling, Mearns was able to define a search box of manageable size. In February 2008, the survey vessel Geosounder departed for the search area carrying deep-water sonar equipment capable of imaging the seabed at depths of 3,000 meters. On the 12th of March 2008 at 5:30 in the afternoon, the sonar operator aboard Geosounder saw something on his screen. It was unmistakably a shipwreck, a large vessel lying in 2 pieces on the seabed, surrounded by debris. The depth was 2,560 meters. The position matched the estimated drift of Cormoran's lifeboats almost exactly. They had found the raider. Mearns immediately redirected the search toward the southeast, following the bearing on which Sydney had last been seen. 4 days later, at 11:03 on the morning of the 16th of March, the sonar revealed a second wreck, HM as Sydney lay at a depth of 2,468 meters, approximately 11 nautical miles from Cormoran. She was on her side, her bow section, separated from the main hull, surrounded by a debris field of fittings and equipment torn loose during her violent descent to the bottom. For the first time in 67 years, the lost cruiser had been found. When Prime Minister Kevin Rudd announced the discovery, he spoke of the significance for the families of the lost. "This is a very important day for all of those who lost loved ones when the Sydney went down," he said. "The discovery of both wrecks allows the families of those who lost their lives to grieve at last." Aboard Geosounder, the search team held a memorial service over the wreck site. They read the names of the fallen. They played the last post. They cast wreaths into the water, watching as the flowers drifted down toward the cold darkness where Sydney lay. After 67 years, the men of Sydney had been found. In the months following the discovery, remotely operated vehicles descended to the wrecks and transmitted images to the surface. What they revealed confirmed the German accounts in almost every detail. Sydney's bridge structure showed catastrophic damage from shell hits. The forward turrets had been destroyed while still trained on the bearing where Cormoran had been. Fire damage extended along the entire length of the ship. The torpedo wound forward was clearly visible, the plating peeled back by the explosion. Cormoran's wreck confirmed the effectiveness of Sydney's return fire. Shell holes pocked the machinery spaces. The mine hold had been obliterated by the scuttling charges, leaving the ship in 2 massive pieces. The Cole Inquiry, established to examine all evidence surrounding the loss, concluded in 2009 that the German survivors had told the truth. There was no evidence of war crimes, no evidence of Japanese involvement, no evidence of a government cover-up. Captain Burnett had brought his ship too close to an unidentified vessel, forfeiting all tactical advantages. When Cormoran revealed her weapons and opened fire, Sydney was doomed. As for why there were no survivors, the inquiry provided a grim explanation. The intensity of Cormoran's fire had inflicted massive casualties within the first minutes of the battle. The fragmentation from high-explosive shells had swept the exposed decks. The destruction of lifeboats and life-saving equipment meant that even those who survived the battle had no means of escape. When Sydney finally sank, she took her remaining crew with her. One body alone was ever recovered. In February 1942, a Carly float washed ashore on Christmas Island, carrying the remains of a young sailor. For nearly 80 years, he was known only as the Unknown Sailor. In 2021, DNA analysis finally identified him as able seaman Thomas Welsby Clark, 21 years old, from Sydney. He remains the only man from HMAS Sydney whose resting place is marked by a grave. Today, both wrecks are protected as war graves under Australian law. They lie on the seabed, slowly corroding in the cold and darkness, undisturbed by the world above. The HMS Sydney II Memorial stands at Geraldton, on the western Australian coast, looking out over the Indian Ocean toward the battle site. A silver dome contains 645 metal seagulls, one for each man lost. Below it, a bronze woman gazes toward the horizon, waiting for a ship that will never return. Every year on the 19th of November, Australians gather to remember what happened on that calm afternoon in 1941. They remember a battle that lasted barely 30 minutes and claimed nearly 700 lives. They remember a mystery that haunted their nation for generations. Most of all, they remember the men, the officers and sailors who had steamed proudly into Sydney Harbor less than a year earlier, heroes returning from victory in the Mediterranean. The young men who had enlisted to serve their country and died before most of them had seen their 25th birthday. The fathers and husbands and sons who never came home. HMS Sydney was the pride of the Royal Australian Navy, a ship that had proved Australia could stand among the great naval powers of the world. Her loss reminded a nation that in war, pride can be the most dangerous weapon of all. Two ships met in the Indian Ocean. Both died. One crew survived to tell the tale. The other is remembered only in silence. In memory of the 645 men of HMAS Sydney II lost on the 19th of November, 1941, lest we forget.